Uh, you all know that we talked about before, David wanted to build the temple, and that was his desire, but God did not allow him to do it, but he chose his son Solomon to build it. Solomon, everything he did in preparation for this temple was in grand style. He hired master craftsmen from Tyre to oversee the construction. It took over 153,000 people to build it. It took 7 years. Estimates over 250, $300 billion in today's money. And up until last week's lesson, we saw all the gold, the silver, all the bronze was in the temple. All the temple furnishings were in place, but except it lacked one thing. We saw last week that was the Ark of the Covenant, and we talked about that last week. And without that Ark being in the temple, it was nothing more than just an empty building. Also, too, you think about it, too, everything in that temple that was in the temple was new. Everything was brand new except for one thing, and that was the most important thing, the Ark. And so we read all about that last week. We studied about that, and between the end of last week's lesson and today's lesson, there was a prayer in there which we're not going to read about, but that was Solomon's prayer to the dedication of the temple, and that's one of the longest prayers there the longest prayer in the Bible there. We're not going to read that, but we're going to jump forward to this week. So again, we got to realize, too, this week's lesson and last week's lesson sort of goes hand in hand. This is all one event that's taking place here. So we'll go ahead and read. Y'all ready? Short notice one.
Okay. Dedication of the temple, 2 Chronicles 7, 1 through 22. When Solomon had finished praying, fire came down from heaven and consumed the burnt offering and the sacrifices, and the glory of the Lord filled the temple. And the priests could not enter the house of the Lord because the glory of the Lord had filled the Lord's house. When all the children of Israel saw how the fire came down and the glory of the Lord on the temple, they bowed their faces to the ground on the pavement and worshiped and praised the Lord, saying, "For he is good, for his mercy endures forever." Then the king and all the people offered sacrifices before the Lord. King Solomon offered a sacrifice of 22,000 bulls and 120,000 sheep. So the king and all the people dedicated the house of God. And the priests attended their services, the Levites also, with instruments of music of the Lord, which King David had made to praise the Lord, saying, "For his mercy endures forever." Whenever David offered praise by their ministry, the priests sounded trumpets opposite them, while all Israel stood. Furthermore, Solomon consecrated the middle of the court that was in front of the house of the Lord, for there he offered burnt offerings and the fat of the peace offerings, because the bronze altar which Solomon had made was not able to receive the burnt offerings, the grain offerings, and the fat. At that time, Solomon kept the feast 7 days, and all Israel with him, a very great assembly from the entrance of Hamath to the brook of Egypt. And on the 8th day, they held a sacred assembly, for they observed the dedication of the altar 7 days, and the feast 7 days. On the 23rd day of the 7th month, he sent the people away to their tents, joyful and glad of heart for the good that the Lord had done for David, for Solomon, and for his people Israel. Thus Solomon finished the house of the Lord and the king's house, and Solomon successively accomplished all that came into his heart to make in the house of the Lord and in his own house. Then the Lord appeared to Solomon by night and said to him, "I have heard your prayer and have chosen this place for myself as a house of sacrifice. When I shut up heaven and there is no rain, or command the locusts to devour the land, or send pestilence among my people, if my people who are called by my name will humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then I will hear from heaven and will forgive their sin and heal their land. Now my eyes will be open and my ears attentive to prayer made in this place. For now I have chosen and sanctified this house, that my name may be there forever, and my eyes and my heart will be there perpetually. As for you, if you walk before me as your father David walked, and do according to all that I have commanded you, and if you keep my statutes and my judgments, then I will establish the throne of your kingdom, as I coveted with David your father, saying, you shall not fail to have a man as a ruler in Israel. But if you turn away and forsake my statutes and my commandments, which I have set before you, and go and serve other gods and worship them, then I will uproot them from my land, which I have given them. And this house which I have sanctified for my name, I will cast out of my sight, and will make it a proverb and a byword among all peoples. As for this house which is exalted, everyone who passes by it will be astonished and say, why has the Lord done this to this land and this house? Then they will answer, because they forsook the Lord God of their fathers, who brought them out of the land of Egypt, and embraced other gods, and worshipped them and served them. Therefore he has brought all this calamity on them.
I just realized we forgot announcements too. So does anybody have any announcements, any prayer requests? Anybody? Uh-huh. Yeah, I'd seen that on the news last night. I about told you about the news about all the flooding they're worried about out there. Yes, ma'am. Okay, yeah. Y'all are used to that, aren't you? Sort of on. It's gotta be Kentucky right now, aren't you? Of course, that's California, but still. Anybody else? Yeah, I apologize. I don't know. I forgot about that. Last night we, Caden come home and it's funny how you do things. We go to Bowling Green and got to halfway to Bowling Green, realized I didn't have any gas. I had 35 miles empty. I reached and I'd made reservation. I called Texas Roadhouse, got over there. I left my phone at home. I left my billfold at home. Kay didn't have his phone. Trace didn't have, he didn't have his billfold. Nobody had their billfold. Dottie we didn't have a credit card. Went to eat, so I got $20 off his girlfriend to get gas with. And I was like, I can't believe I went to Bowling Green, but I did have a gift card, my billfold for a meal, but I didn't have nothing to tip. So Caden, his phone, he could actually use his phone as I guess you can tap your phone for Apple Pay or whatever. So we made it, but it's better to prepare. That's the first time I've ever went anywhere without my billfold. I didn't realize nobody else in my family carries a billfold. So, but anyway, let's go ahead and get started here. Okay, this week, the lesson is like it was last week. The dedication of the temple. When Solomon did something, Solomon always, he sort of put on a show. And this was like a 14-day, it ended up being like a 14-day, actually 15-day festival with last week's lesson, almost like the opening of the Olympics you might compare it to as far as, that's a bad analogy, but still, it's a grand opening for the temple here. I was reading that, the temple, it says here, the temple probably could have been completed actually 11 months earlier. it was completed like in the 8th month, which in our calendars like in October or November. And they didn't move into this ceremony that we're having here was in the 7th month, which is around September, October. So it had been sitting empty probably for around 11 months after it had been built. Now, whether or not that was just to get all the temple furnishings into it, or if it's just time for preparing for this grand opening, or maybe they waited around for this Feast of Tabernacles to have it during this time. But anyway, the temple had been unoccupied for about 11 months before this grand opening that we were reading about last week and this week. And this week, the text, what Brad read there a while ago, is sort of divided into two sections. And the first 10 verses was like what we talked about last week, the dedication of the temple. And then when you look there at verse 11, there's the Lord appears to Solomon in a prayer. And that's after Solomon had completed his building of his home, his house. So again, that was 13 years later. So there's a break there in this chapter. Even though it goes one verse to the next, there's probably about a 13-year period there, separation there. And of course, that's where the Lord appears to Solomon and tells him, which he had done, which Solomon knew it had happened before. You'll be me. You do what you're supposed to do. Good things are going to happen to you if you fall away from me. These are going to be the results, and we read that there toward the end of that scripture there Brad read a while ago. So any comments before we get started here? Okay. Let's go ahead and jump into the questions, and again, feel free to speak up anytime. Question number 1. What was more importance than animal sacrifices Israel was to offer to God? They followed him? Yeah, that was, just obey him. What was the purpose of the animal sacrifices in the first place? Yes, yeah. It was sort of like a temporary covering of sin. It was something that, of course, he was commanded by God. It's something that he did. And I guess the thought behind it was that the animal that you offered for a sacrifice was in your place. Because, you may deserve death for the sin, but the animal sort of died in your place. But it was only temporary. That's why he just kept doing it over and over and over again. And I know we're talking about sacrifices, and there's a lot of sacrifices going on here today, but what did away with the sacrificial system? Christ, yeah. Good.
God killed an animal to put a skin on, make clothes for the revelation.
Mm-hmm.
The first sin required bloodshed. And that was kind of tied all the way through to Christ.
And I've always wondered too, the sacrificial system was put into place when Moses, all the laws that they, in Leviticus there, but there were sacrifices offered before that too. And other religions or other people offered sacrifices. So I assume it was just sort of a way of just giving your gifts to God at first. But again, in this time, it turned into a point, it was for the forgiveness of your sins or to roll your sins forward or whatever to allow you to, it covered your sins for a while. Of course, like I said, when Christ came, as we're talking about today, the temple, of course, it's not the same temple. Solomon's temple was torn down or not say destroyed, but the temple in Jerusalem when Christ came, we see when he died upon the cross, on his death, what happened to that holy place? It's ripped in two, yeah. So that did away, that covenant that God had with the people there was no longer in place when Christ died. But again, like I said, today though, it's most important that we follow him to answer that question. Question number 2. In what way was God too big for the temple built by Solomon? What's that? His glory, yeah. And that's part of it. And, he was the creator. He everything was from God. God is Everything we have is from God. You know, does God need a temple? No, he doesn't need a temple. He doesn't need anything. You know, God created the heavens and the earth. He gave us everything. You know, but what does God want from us? You know, obedience. He wants our hearts, you know. Again, you know, we can't give God anything because God has it all. But we can't give him our hearts. You know, if we give him our hearts, then he'll get our money, he'll get our time, he'll get our commitment, he'll get our dedication, he'll get all the things that in our lives. But we have to give that, you know, we have to give that to him because, you know, again, God is everything. You know, without God, we'd have nothing. But sometimes, you know, we feel like, you know, when we're doing things for God, but, you know, that should be for our, it should be for us, not for him. Any other comments? Question number 3. Okay, what kept the priest from entering the temple after it had been dedicated? Glory of the Lord, yes. The glory of the Lord. And what I read that, of course it said, verse 1 says, fire came down and consumed the burnt offerings and sacrifices, and the glory of the Lord filled. So whether the glory of the Lord was it a cloud or was it just his, it doesn't really say here if it's just his presence. I'm not sure what it was. But either way, I think it's something, if you were there at that time and place, you would probably understood that something significant, you know, it wasn't just, you know, something was there that they experienced that day, that they knew that God's presence was with them during all of this. Question number 4. What did the people do when they saw fire come down from heaven and fill the temple? Yeah. So look around and worshiped. And again, of course, you know, that was fire. Of course, the fire from heaven. What did the fire from heaven do that day? It consumed all the sacrifices. Yeah, and that, you know, it was, you know, God was pleased with what they were doing. Of course, we've seen. That's not the only time we've seen fire come from. I said we've not seen. We've read about fire come from heaven. But again, you know, you could imagine. You know, it says they fell straight to the pavement. It said and worship God. I mean, I could imagine too if we were to be somewhere and we were to see fire from heaven, that would definitely be something we've never seen before. But, you know, I was thinking about this, you know, that was a sign from God that he was pleased. But, you know, but Solomon, you know, he was there. You know, there are a lot of people there. And, you know, sometimes we always, you know, we read in the Bible where people ask for a sign, and what did he say? He said that I've already sent the prophets and all the other, you know, and you ignore them. You know, why are you going to ignore this? You know, so today, you know, I think, but you look there at Solomon. You know, Solomon, he saw that. And you sometimes wonder, you know, you think, well, gosh, if I saw fire come from heaven, I would never turn from God. But we see Solomon did that. And I think, too, today in our lives, I mean, we don't get fire from heaven, but do we see signs from God every day? Yeah, I think we do. Just the fact that we're all in this building talking and I can speak and hopefully y'all can understand me, you know, that's a sign. That shows that, you know, that's the ability to communicate, the ability to visualize people, to sit there and feel a heartbeat. You know, it's just the complexity of a human being, the complexity of this world, you know, the ability to look out and see all that's created. It had to come from somewhere, and in our belief it is from God. And we see that sign each and every day, and it's a constant reminder to us, you know, we don't need to have fire from heaven. You know, people in the Bible, they saw things we've never seen, and they still had a problem with idolatry. They still had problems. So you know, I think sometimes you may think, gosh, if God would do this, it would increase my faith. But, you know, that's not necessary because there's enough things out there to increase our faith if we just allow it to do that, and we study and do the things that will make us more faithful. If we put our hearts and mind, you know, toward Him. Okay. Question number 5. How many oxen and sheep did Solomon offer as sacrifices to God? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Of course, this happened over a period of 14 to 15 days, you know. I think there's, yeah, there's 15 days, but you know, again, this is, you know, again, shows Solomon, you know, Solomon, he did something, they put on a grand show, but also too shows sacrifices that it was temporary because, you know, it's mind-boggling. You think 22,000 bulls, that's, you know, I'm not a farmer, but just the numbers themselves are staggering, and I don't think anybody's ever saw 22,000 head of cattle in one place at one time, you know. And to see that in 120,000 sheep, you know, that's mind-boggling to us. But again, all those sacrifices, you would think that the children of Israel would be clean for their sins for the next, you know, hundreds of years. It was, they wouldn't have to offer them for years, but that was just, you know, again, this was a celebration. But, you know, again, it just showed the sacrificial system was something only temporary. This is only something that could be done. And again, we talked about the temple. Like, how can you sacrifice that many animals in that period of time? Well, of course, anything can be done with God's hand in it. But also, too, like we was talking about, too, you know, it was 11 months between the time of when the temple was finished until the temple, this day it happened. So I'm sure there's a lot of preparation went into the place there. And also, too, it talked about, too, the bronze altar there wasn't even big enough for all this stuff. So I think they went outside the temple area there and did a lot of these sacrifices. But any comments or questions so far?
Displaying the grandness of everything that will probably never be again. I mean, we'll never probably see that many things and that many people that much in one place to honor. You know, I mean, God did it. When God does something, He does it in a way that nobody else can replicate. I think that's what's happening here. Think about the food and the things and the logistics it would take just to feed that many people to come to that celebration and do all the things that they did.
I don't think food is a problem.
No,
I'm just kidding.
I agree. I'm just saying, just think about all the logistics.
But you're right about it. Well, didn't they eat cattle?
Yeah, so God did something in a way that nobody else probably gonna ever replicate, just like building a temple, you know, just like maybe the richest person ever on earth. I don't think there'll ever be anybody, you know, as rich as him because God said that they would. So this was just the most grandeur thing you'll ever have, leading up to Christ dying on the cross.
Like today, you know, Al's in the Farm Bureau, but I don't think you get 22,000 head of cattle here in 2 weeks, could you? I'm saying it's a pretty enormous task. That's the point there, you know. And that's 120,000 sheep. You know, that's a lot of sheep.
When I was young, at 20, I went to Israel, and at the Dome of the Rock, there's a big rock that they did all those sacrifices on. It had a big hole drilled. It had a hole drilled in it where the blood would go down into the lower level. You could go down in there. It's interesting. So to think that, I mean, they had a system for that.
Yeah, we got some people we know that's over there right now in Israel. That's on my bucket list. I don't know if I ever make it or not. But, is it? Yeah, that'd be a fascinating place to go and visit, to say the least. Okay, question number 6. How did the Levites differ from the priests in the service of the temple? What's that? Assistance, yeah. Yeah, the priests of Israel, you know, were basically a group of qualified men from the tribe of Levi. You know, of course, the priests, what were their responsibilities mostly? Temple worship, yeah, and sacrifices, those type of things. And of course, the Levites sort of helped out with all that sort of like what the priests didn't do. I think we said last week they sort of led or helped out with the worship and stuff and probably took care of the temple, the Levites did. But I guess the thing to know, all priests were Levites, but not all Levites were priests. That's the way to sort of look at it that way. So, but they were all from the same tribe there. I think Aaron was the first one that sort of, the first priest there of that family. Okay. Question number 7. Why did the Bible say that the feast for the dedication of the temple, when the Bible says the feast for the dedication of the temple lasted for 7 days, what feast was it talking about? Feast of the Tabernacle, yeah. And, I read that as, at first it says the Feast of the Dedication prior to the Feast of the Tabernacles, but I think they were all there for the Feast of the Tabernacles, that's what it was all for. Basically, it was one expanded feast. Some people say, well, the Feast of the Tabernacle usually lasted 7 days, and they just extended it. And we said he waited, probably 11 months. The Feast of the Tabernacle, it was something that they celebrated on a yearly basis. It was where they basically came in, and one family representative had to come to Jerusalem. So it was, now whether or not your whole family could have went, and when I say family representative, where that meant grandpa could went for the whole family, or but one male from each family had to be there. I'm not sure how that worked. Or you could have brought the whole family, but they would come to Jerusalem to celebrate the fact that when they were in the wilderness wandering for 40 years, that God provided for them, and they stayed in tents. And it was basically a festival just to remember what God had provided for them during the years that they were in the wilderness. So again, that's why you probably feel like this is one that, there were several. I think they said Pentecost was a day once a year they came for the Passover, and this is a different, for the Feast of the Tabernacle. So that was the reason that they probably was planned around this, because they knew that because we see there's a lot of people at this event, and the purpose of it probably during this Feast of the Tabernacle, so you could have as many people there in Jerusalem for this. Question number 8. Where did Solomon tell the people of Israel to go after the temple was dedicated? Oh, yeah. To the tents, yeah. To the tents. And of course, it shows that we're talking about the Feast of the Tabernacles. They were all probably dwelling in their tents. That was part of the feast there, so they were probably in their tents there. Verse 10. How did it say they went home? Did anybody get that? How did they go home? What state of mind did they go home with? Verse 10 there. Yeah, joyful and glad, it said, yeah. And joyful and glad of heart. And that's what applies to us today too. We come to church each and every Sunday. How should we leave this building? Joyful and glad of heart, glad to be here. And that should be our attitude. It shouldn't be get in the car and say, well, that singing was terrible today, or or preacher, man, I didn't understand the thing he said, or the building's too hot, the building's too cold, sometimes. And you think about it too, this is a 15-day celebration. I mean, could you imagine we went over 15 minutes on a Sunday morning? We'd all be like, looking at our watches and stuff. But again, it just shows that, that what they had experienced there, that what they had been there during this time was something that was pretty miraculous there too. But again, they all left there pretty happy, joyful for what they'd seen that the Lord had done for them, it said. Okay. Question number 9. What part did the temple play in Israel's religious life when dire circumstances called on them to turn to God? Mm-hmm. Yeah, if you read the conclusions there, I think it says, the conclusion here, it says, Christian people have no temple as Solomon has, still they are to give their best that they have to the Lord. On the one hand, a meeting place is more than a meeting place, but on the other hand, a meeting place may... No, I'm reading the wrong spot here, I'm sorry. Page 383. I've got ahead of myself, I'm sorry. page 383, I'm sorry, 382, when the third paragraph, it said, God had promised the kings he would hear the pleas of his people when they turned to the temple. But he reminded them that the temple was no talisman, no good luck piece. The people were to humble themselves. They returned from their wicked ways and seek his face. So, the temple was something they always thought that protected them. And we talked, like we talked about last week with the Ark of Covenant, they took it into the battle with the Philistines, and they lost it because they thought that was their good luck piece. In the same way, too, with the temple, they thought as long as the temple was in Jerusalem, as long as it was standing, God was there, that nobody could ever capture Jerusalem. So when the Babylonians were knocking at the door, they're like, we've got the temple here, But then it says, you look back in this reading here at the very end, it says, if you don't do what I tell you to do, it said that people will walk by the house and say, what has the Lord done thus to this land and this house? So God warned them that, if they did turn away from him, that temple, even though they thought it was their, get out of jail free card, you might say, that they would always be able to, whatever they done, that they never would be punished for it. We see here that they were. In question number 10, what would God do to the temple if Israel or its kings were unfaithful to Yahweh?
He would turn away from them and the temple would be more.
Exactly. He would turn away from the temple. Somebody say something else or same? Uproot from the land, yeah. And what did that happen? We've studied that, back, I guess, in the fall, that did happen when they were captured by the Babylonians and they were carried off to Babylon, and the remnant came back. But so all that God prophesied, all God that told them would happen to them if they did not obey him, did in fact happen to them later on. Okay, any comments or questions? Now, question number 1 in the discussion. What were the similarities and differences of the temple to God in Jerusalem and the temples of other places? Central place to worship, yeah. What other similarities or differences? Face the east. What was that for? Yeah. And that was sort of the people. It said there in our Bible or our book. It said, the people. If you were a true Israelite, you knew that God did not dwell in that building anyway. Because a lot of the other temples, they faced earth toward the sun, because that way when the sun, the sun came up in the morning, their gods would be able to see the sun. Of course, that wasn't necessary for their God, the Israelites' God, because he created the sun. So it wasn't. No matter where they replaced it, it really didn't matter. And again, the Israelites knew that, a lot of these other temples, they offer sacrifices to their gods. What was their sacrifices for? Bad question. They were offering them food for the gods. They were feeding their gods, And, the Israelite, our God, he doesn't need to be fed. That's not for that. The sacrifices were for your sins to be forgiven. Let's see what else I wrote down here. But yeah, there was, but again, you think about too here is, a lot of places probably, I'm not sure, I know later on a lot of places had different other temples in one city or different, they were, different places where they worship their God. But the one thing about Jerusalem, there was always, the temple was, Brian said that was a central meeting place for the children of Israel, and I never seen really any evidence that maybe anything else was ever built there besides the temple. Question number 2, what place did the temple play in the religious life of the people of Israel, and was a building of no importance? What did it play? How did it?
To the people, house.
And like you said too, it was you know, you would think that the temple in Jerusalem, I may be wrong, but you would think it was a busy place. Because when people came, they came to Jerusalem, they went to the temple. You know, you had the priests there each and every day, probably the Levites, you know, the things are probably, it was probably, I may be wrong about this, but I would assume it was probably one of the central locations of Israel. I mean, not of Israel, of Jerusalem, because you would think it would be a happening place. And it's, again, you know, like we talked about before, it's a place where they could come together, they could worship, they could offer sacrifices. The other question, was a building of no importance? Huh? Yeah. Sort of like a yes or no question. Yeah, you could answer it both ways. I put yes, you know, it's beautiful, it had gold and silver, it took all those years to construct. It contained the ark, you know, that's where they came, they worshiped God. But no, you know, when it's all, it's just a building in all things, really, it's just a building. And when they turned away from God and they worship other gods, what did it become? Destroyed, you know. God allowed the temple to be destroyed there. Question number 3. Let me get it done early today. Does a nicely built building for worship have anything to do with God's people of today being faithful to Him? No, it doesn't. But I say it doesn't, but you know, in a way, I guess in some places it does. You know, because there are some people that, you know, in our church here, you know, our building's nice. We have a nice building. We come here on Sundays, we worship, and it's used for other things. You know, it's not just used for worship service. We use it for, of course, you know, we've been doing the food drives. That one thing, you know, at one time when the flooding happened, we had a daycare here for a few months. There's always meetings and stuff, but it's just, you know, there's a lot of things that go on in this building. So in that aspect, you know, the building's significant. You know, larger cities, you know, I've been in places before, you know, you ever been on a trip and visited another, a church or something other, you know, like in New York, right across from, it was the Rockefeller Center, that Catholic church there, people walk in and out of all day long, and you know, so a lot of people, I say, maybe we may not use our church is significant, but some churches use their buildings a lot, you know. I mean, if you ever read some of, I don't know how to bring this up or not, but you know, he's Catholic, but you know, like John Calipari, you read this, he'd be like, I went by and prayed, he goes by and prays somewhere every morning, you know. So obviously, he goes into a church building every morning that's opened up. So, you know, some churches, you know, are opened up and people are in and out of it all the time. And ours can be if we need to be, but again, you know, this is there's a lot of different churches in this town, and it's not the central location. It's not the one, you know, if this is the only church in all of Allegheny, then it might be that way, like the temple. Go ahead, Sean. Yeah.
And that's what you're describing. It's a tool to remind people or give people a place to do. It's just a tool. It's not a holy, most holy.
Right. No,
our body is a temple now. That's the difference. The temple that he's building is now, after Christ came, our body is a living temple. So that's what we're supposed to be buffering daily. But it's a tool like anything else to serve. You know, before we had welfare, before we had the government doing a lot of things, churches took care and still do, take care of a large number of homeless people and people that need food, and just like we're doing here, it's a tool that God knows that if we do that, if we help the less fortunate, then it brings blessings back on us because we get as many blessings as we give.
Mm-hmm.
When it comes to it, so it's just a tool.
Next question, you know, does the building have anything to do with people being faithful to Him? Well, you know, it can, the fact that that's your tool to be faithful. You know, if you didn't have a building, you didn't have a place to worship, you just worshiping in homes, you should still have the same outcome, but you may not either, you know. Yeah.
So one thing about the temple is that's where the priests were at.
Mm-hmm.
And they would go through the priest to have access to God at that time. So priesthood is not here. Our priesthood is through Christ. We all carry that with us. We all are priests. So the structure has its needs, I think, at the time. Temple did, because that's where they would go to do their sacrifices to God. They would take care of the things that were required by the law of Moses, where they always had to go to the priest to get to whatever sacrifices, consecrate themselves or do whatever. So different construct of what they had to go through.
That's a good point. Any other comments? Okay, and last question here. And for the ancient people of Israel or for the contemporary church, what is the more importance than a beautiful place of worship? Is that?
Heart, everything.
Heart.
Knowing that God exists, be faithful and believe.
Right. Just, again, like we talked about, it's nice, we've got a church building, we're definitely blessed to have a church building. And without this, like I said, like Sean said, this church building's a tool, but we don't need it. But it's definitely nice to have, and it would probably, in all actuality, if we didn't have it, we probably wouldn't have the attendance and the people showing up and the ability to come together as we would like to. So that's. But again, like we all say, as far as the building itself, we've all said all of our life, it's never really been of any importance, but in theory, in theory it's not of any importance, but, technically it does facilitate things, make things a lot easier for us to get together, come together, have a nice, it will be 98 degrees Friday, you'd hate to be outside trying to have a lesson during the heat.
I was just thinking when COVID was going on, we visited with our son that was in Nashville, and they weren't meeting in a building, they were meeting at that time. One of the members had a pretty good sized property, and so the members were just bringing their chairs and meeting out, in this field in the shade, and we had services out there. And I think what was good about that was that these all, their neighbors were able to see people worship. And I don't know, there's something, just like this was primarily outdoor with the Jews, getting all together. And sometimes maybe we lose something with that.
That's a good point there,
Almost like the old revivals, people, you could go by and hear people singing in those tents or what,
Yeah, and you're right, and they always said that, of course, it has nothing to do with the building, but the church itself, if you ever close your door, would the community miss you or not, and that's, you tell how you're doing stuff, and so we can't, people don't see what we do, but hopefully they'll see what we do, but still, that's what you're saying there. It would be if people saw, if you can share that with others, because like I said, once you shut those doors, of course we've got it goes online and stuff like that, but again, everybody does that now too, so you can share it with a few people, but not as many as you'd like. Any questions, comments? All right. See y'all next week.